This conference will now be recorded.
All right, well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Wednesday, May 26th meeting of the Tampa Bay Nitrogen Management Consortium. My name is Santino Provenzano. I'm the industry co-chair. I'd like to take a few minutes here to just kind of go around the room and do some quick introductions. I don't see Jeff on at the moment, but we'll go ahead and maybe start with staff. So Ed, take it away, and then maybe we can go from there.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for attending this morning. Ed Sherwood, Executive Director of the Tampa Bay Estuary Program.
I'm Maya Burke, the Assistant Director of the Tampa Bay Estuary Program.
I'm Ryan Reisig, Pinellas County Environmental Management Division of Public Works.
I'm gonna go down my screen. Marcus?
Yeah, hi, this is Marcus Beck with the Tampa Bay Estuary Program.
I'd just like to ask really quick, if you're not actively participating, if you could please mute your audio. Thank you.
Aaron, do you have a mic? Aaron Lotion?
Hi, this is Aaron Lotion with Kinder Morgan.
Alana?
Yeah, hi. Are you doing attendance? Hi, I'm here.
Alana Todd with TBRPC.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Alicia?
Hi, Alicia Osmus, Busch Gardens, Tampa.
Amy?
Amy Butler, Tampa Electric Company.
Bill?
Bill Anderson, City of Lakeland.
Susan?
Susan Ockley with the City of Bradenton.
Chris? Claus?
Chris Claus, Interested Citizen.
Oh, that's different. Chris Pratt? Chris Pratt with EPC. Daniel?
Daniel Simpson, City of Oldsmar.
David?
Good morning, David Glicksberg with Hillsborough County Public Utilities.
Elise?
Elise Marson, University of Florida.
Aaron?
Aaron DeVacco, Kinder Morgan.
Greg?
Hey, good morning. Greg Canolfi with Polk County Water Resources.
Heather?
Good morning. This is Heather Maggio with the City of Tampa.
Ilya?
Good morning, Ilya. Welcome to Duke Energy.
Isabel?
Good morning. This is Isabel Hall with Tetra Tech.
Jay Jernigan? Jay, we can't hear you. Jan McLean?
Good morning, Jan McLean with the City of Tampa. Hello, all.
Hey. Jeff Hilton?
Jeff Hilton, City of Tampa.
Jess?
Hey, this is Jess Stempian with the Florida Department of Ag, also Ag Water Policy.
John? McGee?
Hi, John McGee with the City of Plant City.
John Ryan?
Hi, John Ryan, Sarasota County.
Julie?
Julie Christian, EPC.
Kirsty? She's with EPC too. Lizanne? Lizanne Garcia, Southwest Florida Water Management District Swim Program. Mike Perry? He's with St. Pete. Michelle?
Good morning, Michelle Duggan, Pinellas County Utilities.
Michelle Holton?
Michelle Holton, Hillsborough County Public Utilities.
Mike?
Mike Wessel, Janicki Environmental.
We got Tino. Reed? Rich Gardner?
Rich Gardner, City of Clearwater Public Utilities.
Rob Brown.
Rob Brown, Manatee County.
I think we got Ryan. Sarah Kessler.
Sarah Kessler, City of Clearwater.
Sarah Malone. Sarah Malone's with Lakeland. Scott Browning.
Good morning, this is Scott, Manatee County Environmental Protection.
Scott Dietschy.
Scott Ditchy, GPI.
Simon.
Simon Bolin, Agribusiness Development Manager for Hillsborough County Economic Development.
Stacy.
AC Day, Pinellas County Environmental Management.
Suganda. Suganda's with FWC. Chris A.
Hey, morning, everybody. Chris Anastasio, Swift Mud Swim Program.
Tara.
Good morning, Tara Harder, Swift Mud Swim Program.
Tom.
Tom Ash, Environmental Protection Commission.
And Winston.
Winston Borkowski, Hopping Green and Sam's on for Tropicana.
Thank you all for being here. There may be a few folks that popped in while I was going through the list. If you want to introduce yourself, now's your opportunity. Otherwise, we'll get rolling.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I know that's a little painful remotely, but do think it's important to make sure everybody knows who's in attendance. So with that, we'll hand it over to Ed, who's going to give us a quick update on Piney Point. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you all. Appreciate the opportunity this morning. I think last we met April 1st, we were basically at the beginning of the emergency discharges of Piney Point. So we wanted to give you a brief update of what has happened since that time and what we're observing in terms of the monitoring data that has started coming back from agencies responding. So you guys see my screen okay? Excellent. So as mentioned, back late March, HRK holding staff started noticing increasing effluent concentrations in some of their outfalls, and that led to the observation that there was a potential breach forming in one of the retaining walls of the Piney Point facility. As you all probably know by now, that led to both state and local emergency orders to address the imminent threat of the containment walls collapsing and causing the mix of process and seawater of discharging to the surrounding community and affecting some of the port infrastructure and the residential homes in and around that area. So in lieu of that catastrophic failure of the containment walls, there was emergency discharges directly to lower Tampa Bay via Port Manatee. There's about 215 million gallons of processed seawater mix discharged to the vicinity of Port Manatee berth 12 from March 30th to April 9th. That equated to about 205 tons of total nitrogen discharged directly to the bay. And just to put things into context, I have some historic loading information for all the bay segments. Lower Tampa Bay is the fourth panel down, and loadings in total to lower Tampa Bay on an annual basis since about 2005 have been at or below about 200 tons per year. So over that 10-day period, that portion of the bay received the equivalent amount of load of what it typically experiences in an annual period. So that, of course, raised some concerns in terms of that mass of nitrogen going into the bay and what that could mean in terms of the bay's response. As you all know, why we gather here through the Nitrogen Management Consortium, we're trying to manage nitrogen loads to the bay, and I put up the allocations from lower Tampa Bay here, highlighting the Piney Point facility. So the Piney Point facility received an allocation of 0.9 tons per year when we developed the allocations back in the 2009-2010 time period. Again, significant amount of load from the processed water that was contained on site that was discharged to the bay. And as you can see, we're probably going to exceed that total nitrogen load to to lower Tampa Bay for 2020 based on the emergency discharge that occurred. Again, why we're all gathered here is to manage nitrogen loads for the benefit of improving water quality for the benefit of seagrass recovery in the bay. So again, this is a concern when these type of events happen as we continue to make progress in managing water quality for the benefit of seagrass. So we as a program interfaced with a lot of the responding agencies at the time. The primary responders, DEP and Manatee County, were quickly on site to address the emergency situation. But from a broader ecological perspective, the estuary program was very much interested of what the impacts of that loading event might be for the ecology of Tampa Bay. We knew the ammonium concentrations in that processed water were fairly significant, averaging over 200 milligrams per liter. And that initial discharge and loading was, the trajectory of that was first modeled by USF's Ocean Circulation Group, and that really guided some of the monitoring efforts in the early part of April and into May. I have on the right there the nowcast forecast that USF puts out on a daily basis. This animation is for this week, and the colors are a little bit misleading in terms of influence, but you know, those green to teals are basically a 1,000-fold to 10,000-fold decrease in concentrations, expected decrease in concentrations from the initial discharge event. So this is now almost 2 months, I shouldn't say that, about a month and a half after the discharge has ceased, but you could see sort of where this model forecasts the influence of that initial discharge throughout the bay and now in the adjacent coastal waters of Pinellas and Manatee counties. So again, that loading, we had concerns about potential shading effects and influence of stimulating algal blooms, macroalgal blooms, and sort of the other cascading effects that might result based on a significant loading effect. So that's what we've been sort of tracking through time now with the different responding agencies. And Chris Anastasio from the Water Management District is also going to give you a little bit of update later, but we also have seen declines unrelated to the initial discharge event of seagrasses in the bay proper, primarily in the upper bay segments, and Chris is going to talk about that a little bit further. But again, these recent observations of those declines in seagrass and then this event occurring leads us to have continuing concerns on the bay's health and ecology moving forward. So from that standpoint, there was a fairly robust monitoring response initiated. Our efforts were to first categorize the initial baseline conditions in and around Port Manatee, and a lot of that was relying on the long-term ambient water quality monitoring programs of both EPC, Manatee County, and Pinellas County to establish a baseline of what expected conditions should be for the areas in and around the discharge, not only over time, but particularly through March and April. So this link I have up here, I can bring up the app and kind of walk you through it. This really summarizes in real time the water quality information as we receive it from a host of different partners that are out there monitoring almost weekly in and around the initial discharge. So I'll step through and stop the presentation there and then go to the website, and I'll kind of show you the features of that. You see the website now on the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So when you first go to the website, it gives you a nice overview of all the different agencies that have responded, the number of parameters, days sampled, all the sites that have been sampled so far. You can see we have pretty profound coverage in and around the port vicinity of Port Manatee. I showed earlier a screen of that baseline data. So if you click on these tabs, you could go to the stations that have been monitored in and around the Port Manatee facility, look at nutrient concentrations, chlorophyll A concentrations, and salinity pH conditions over the historic record, get an idea of what a typical TN value was right before the event, ammonia values right before the event. Click on different stations and it'll refresh the data. A lot of this has been developed from the ground up at the start of the event. A lot of credit goes to Marcus Beck of my staff of putting this together in fairly short order. And our idea again was to kind of contrast those baseline data with whatever new information was collected in response to the event. So the current data tab will take you to some of the data that has been collected. All the stations, if I turn off this one, are highlighted where we have received data so far. And again, it's a host of different agencies that have been supplying and monitoring in the vicinity of Port Manatee. These different drop downs allow you to look at the different water quality parameters, and depending on the toggles you select, you could step through time or contrast it to some of the reference stations. So for chlorophyll A, highlighting all the stations where we have data from chlorophyll A. But if I turn on a toggle, emphasize results out of normal range, it will then, you know, create circles around those points that are one standard deviation above mean values from reference stations. So if you click on this other tab, you can look at the reference stations. So, you know, the blue points that are represented in this map are basically the new data that's been collected, and then the red stations basically draw a line where those new stations were collected and the reference stations that is being compared against. So, you know, not surprisingly, we have seen a chlorophyll response in the lower part of the bay, primarily in and around Port Manatee down to the Skyway Bridge. We started to see some higher chlorophyll A concentrations in the lower part of the bay, and that's related to some, I believe, some red tide observations that have been creeping up from the south. Not directly related to the discharge event, but potentially being exacerbated by the nutrients that are now in the water. So, you know, as I mentioned, you could toggle through the different parameters. You can look at ammonium concentrations. There's also a tab selector to, you know, scroll through the different dates. So right before the start, March 23rd of the discharge, in and around the time of the discharges started, that was actually on the outfall, you know, concentrations well above 215 milligrams per liter. And then, you know, following the event, you could start seeing the data as it was collected in the bay. And initially, you know, when the discharges occurred, we did see high concentrations of ammonia in and around Port Manatee. Later on in the event, we did see a discrete algal bloom just offshore of Port Manatee from satellite imagery that's analyzed by both USF and NOAA. We had a couple of lucky weather events in April. Some storm fronts came through and dissipated that initial algae bloom, but ever since we've kind of had these dispersed rafts of different species that have been observed in the lower part of the bay, anywhere from, you know, pretty significant rafts of Lingbia. There's been observations of trichodesmium blooms in and along the beach areas, and as I mentioned, some red tide that's also been creeping further up in the bay because we haven't had much rain to limit its movement into the high salinity waters that are now occurring pretty much up to the middle Tampa Bay. So we've developed sort of these status updates and briefs. This is from the end of April. We plan to do another one summarizing information through May. But as I mentioned, you know, we've seen a reduction in terms of not necessarily widespread algal blooms in Port Manatee, but we are starting to see sort of these ancillary conditions in the lower part of the bay and along the beach areas where we know sort of the plume trajectory is indicating there might be some influence of the initial discharge. So early on in May, and I believe actually this week, Ryan was saying that, you know, they've been seeing some Trichodesmium blooms off Indian Rocks Beach. And Rob Brown has also mentioned similar sort of blooms along Anna Maria. There's been fairly active rafts of Lingbia this year. They're in and around Robinson Preserve and adjacent to Port Manatee. We actually were out sampling earlier this week, and you know, there's still a significant amount of activity, algal activity in about Port Manatee to the mouth of the bay. And as I mentioned, you know, the concern of this lingering red tide, there's been a bloom of red tide that originated in and around the Naples area going back to October and November that has slowly creeped up just through typical currents and winds further north. Early on in May, there's some significant observations in Sarasota, and now in Tampa Bay, we've started seeing low to very low concentrations of red tide again in and around the Anna Maria Perico Bayou area. And just this week, this is new data from FWC on Monday, we got a medium concentration of red tide in around the Skyway Bridge. So again, this gives us pause. This is the grill in the room as we move forward into the wet season. If and when we start getting significant rains, hopefully that will reduce the salinities to make it not as preferable for red tide to remain in the bay, but that also potentially would introduce more nutrients for these host of algal blooms that are occurring to potentially respond to new nitrogen loads. And you know, the big question of, you know, how that site is fully closed out still remains. So there's still a significant amount of processed water that's still on site. There's about, I think, 186 million gallons still remaining in the stack that was leaking. The levels are below where they believe the breach has occurred in the containment wall. But if we do get significant rainfall this summer, they're going to have to do something with that existing stack water. And we anticipate that there might be additional discharges and some test discharges that occur prior to our official rainy season in June. They have brought on site some innovative technologies to treat the remaining burden of processed seawater mix in that stack as we move through the wet season. But there's sort of limitations on how much water they can process and handle. So fingers crossed that we don't have a really significant rainy season, but we want it to rain enough to potentially knock down the salinities to you know, prevent red tide from lingering in the bay too long through the wet season. So still a lot of questions remain. The monitoring continues. We've been coordinating between the different partners and universities and entities that have been out on site and responding to this event now on a bi-weekly basis, and we anticipate that continuing until there you know, the threat to the bay's ecology or the impacts from the ongoing closure or the initial discharges are not anticipated. So again, I think we won't know for sure that we're out of the woods until I think we get through the rainy season. So we move with caution and continue to monitor and report on the bay's conditions. So that's a real quick summary of where we're at. I don't know if anybody had additional questions on that.
You got two questions in the chat, one from Jan and one from Chris. Jan, do you want to unmute and state your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
I can, and I apologize. I have some landscapers that are outside my window. I don't know if that's coming through.
Well, I'll apologize in advance for any ambulance that comes up behind me outside of my office. So, yeah, I actually made more of a observation. I watched the press conference. I think it was over the weekend. And I was a little confused, if not disappointed. You know, just to be perfectly frank, it kind of sounded like somebody was talking about dilution as the solution to pollution. And there wasn't recognizing the long-term impacts. It sounded like to me, as just the general public, they were saying it's not as bad as we thought it was going to be. And I know that you've been very involved, the estuary program's been very involved, and we appreciate all of that involvement from the, you know, allowing you in from the department and the other parties. But do you feel like they are looking at the longer term impacts, like, and maybe not even so longer term as you just indicated, you know, depending on the weather, or are they more focused on just the local impacts like flooding and you know, things that I know that are immediate public health and safety concerns? That was not a well thought out. It was well thought out, but not well delivered question to you, Ed. I apologize in advance.
I think I understand the gist of what you're getting at. I don't think we're out of the woods yet. You know, how these nutrients might cycle through the bay is still, I think, a prime concern for us. I know there's several university groups, including USF, University of Florida, and FWC, that are attempting to sort of trace the nutrients that might have emanated from the Piney Point discharges into the algal resources that we've been monitoring. So how that nutrients are processed and cycled through the remainder of the wet season is still a concern from the estuary program standpoint. And any significant protracted shading events that might have occurred from the algal observations we have seen, we're still not going to know the impacts to seagrasses probably until the end of this year, where we do our consistent monitoring on long-term transects that we've established throughout the bay. So it's a little bit premature to say that we're all in the clear, especially with the threat of potential additional discharges, although any additional discharges from the site we're hoping will be at much less nutrient concentrations in the future. But I think from the estuary program standpoint, we're still sort of treading lightly in terms of what the data we receive to date is telling us versus what the potential cycling of those nutrients might elicit over the next coming months.
Well, and if I could follow up, you know, I understand how officials would want to alleviate, you know, any kind of heightened concerns for the public, and that's kind of what I was hearing as far as the higher level message. As long as you feel that the agencies are still recognizing that, you know, it's not all in yet, the show's not over yet. Like you just said, we need to follow up and see what the mid to longer term impacts are going to be, especially in light of everything that this group, everyone has accomplished to date. I mean, do you feel like they still have their focus on that, and the message was just to make people feel more comfortable?
I think what our focus on is making sure the initial response doesn't wane through time. So we're actively trying to secure resources to maintain the level of effort and monitoring that has occurred since April for a number of different, not only water quality, but for macroalgae and seagrass in particular, because we don't expect sort of a macroalgae response, significant macroalgae response to happen immediately. That's going to take some time. And like I said, as we see these potential nutrients cycle through the environment, you know, there might be some indicators of poor ecological conditions that we would miss if we don't sustain the monitoring that has taken place so far. And that's been our focus of the estuary program, is making sure that the responding agencies and the state know that we want to continue to do this monitoring, and our partners aren't going to be able to sustain that without additional resources. So I've tried to make those messages clear, and I'm hoping to hear some good news on that front here shortly.
Okay, thank you very much.
Chris, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hey, Ed, I think I know the answer to this question, but I figured I'd pose it anyway. And you kind of touched on it just now, the potential impact of that processed water on the bay and how that's expressed, I think is going to be really important, not only for this event, but also just in general as a better understanding of how our estuaries respond to pollution input into the system. And with that, I know that macroalgae, and when I say macroalgae, I'm talking like benthic macroalgae, so gracilaria, those types of drift algae that we see common throughout the bay. I know that data is captured on the transects. I didn't see any of that data presented this morning, but I was wondering if there is attention being paid to looking at percent cover and or biomass, because this has come up in Sarasota Bay, it's come up in Charlotte Harbor as well, that we focus on chlorophyll concentration, but if that pathway is actually going into the benthic macroalgae, then I think that could potentially be another signal of a response. And the reason I bring that up here is that it's interesting to me that when you look at some of the near shore data, that the water quality data from the water column just offshore of Port Manatee, the concentrations go down really quick. So, I mean, like you showed, you're at like 250 milligrams per liter ammonia in the discharge canal, but you go offshore like a quarter mile and you're down around background levels. That may be an indicator of good news, that whole solution to dilution whatever thing, or it could be that nutrient pathway isn't being expressed in the water column. So this is really a good slide to look at, because as you guys probably know, when you look at the seagrass north of Port Manatee, it's pretty clean, around Cockroach Bay, that area, and then down near Piney Point, where our Rock Ponds project is, the grasses are pretty clean. As soon as you get down around Port Manatee, though, that's when you start really picking up that drift algae. And so, we've been out there a lot during our seagrass mapping effort, and we were out there about 2 weeks, I think, after the spill became public knowledge, and we saw that transition, which I don't think has anything to do with the spill per se, but you can see that macroalgal the drift algae layer really starts to thicken up over the seagrass as you get near and then south of Port Manatee. So I think that might be a really important thing to characterize, and I guess by looking at your screen, it looks like that's being done, so that's good. That was it. I just wanted to bring that up.
That's a good point, and I think in terms of all the data that has been collected in the bay, we don't have a really strong baseline for macroalgae. We attempted to try to get out there as quickly as possible to understand how much macroalgae was in and around Port Manatee prior to the significant discharges, but we don't have any long-term record to really say that that's typical conditions of what the macroalgae look like in March, April. So that's definitely I think a recognized gap. The ambient water quality monitoring programs have been invaluable to our management, but there are other systems that have real-time stations, can estimate to a certain extent real-time loadings to their system. We didn't have any of that information to see how anomalous that 200 tons over that 10-day period might have been relative to, say, like the Little Manatee or Manatee River discharges that might have been occurring. So there's definitely some improvements we can make in terms of reconnaissance for the bay's condition, and that is also, I think, part of the estuary program's charge in response to this event, is making sure that we don't lose sight of all the good work that has been done, but there's also some efficiencies and probably improvements in the monitoring that we can do to better characterize the system, because we know this is probably not going to be the last event that occurs. There's probably going to be other potential discharge events from different facilities or other circumstances, hurricane induced discharges that might impact the bay. So really having a well-grounded and established distributed real-time network is something that I would love to see come out of this as well. Near systems, other aquatic preserve areas are monitored on near real-time basis, and I think we could sort of make that pitch for our system as well. I don't know if I addressed all your questions.
Yeah,
there.
no, that's great. No, thanks, Ed. Yeah, you did. The only thing I just want to add real quick is to your point about, do we know if these persistent drift algae have been there, or are they a response to Piney Point? That picture you showed of that large Lyngbia mat, that's not an uncommon occurrence in this part of the bay. We see that quite often. So I think monitoring is the key, but we have to be careful not to be too quick to blame Piney Point for everything we see out there. And I'm not saying we're doing that, but just if you see a big Lyngbia bloom like that, or you see lots of Lyngbia washing up on shore, just understand that's not that uncommon for this part of the world. Not saying it's not an effect or it hasn't been enhanced, but we just have to keep that in context with what we normally would see in this area.
Yeah, certainly. And it's a good point. And I think I'm hoping with some of the additional research that's being conducted in and around this event, there might be a way to identify potentially the contribution of nutrient sources to some of the rafts that have been sampled of Lyngbia and other algal blooms and water column algal blooms that have been sampled in response to the event. Are there any other questions?
I think Tom had just kind of underscored another point that you made in terms of just remembering that even with the treatment, any future discharges from that pond will include nutrient levels above and beyond what we would expect from that facility.
Yeah, as far as I understand from talking with Mark Brains, the state's chief science officer, has been on site and working with some of the technology companies at the Piney Point facilities. Their concentrations from those treatment technologies are going to be much reduced from that 200 milligrams per liter, but they're still probably going to be around the 4 to 7 milligram per liter total nitrogen concentration. So it's definitely not at sort of background levels. As I mentioned, it will be a load to the bay, and I know there's discussions on potentially timing those discharges to coincide with potentially significant outflow from the rivers. All that's to be determined, and a matter of how they can manage all the water on site in an effective way.
Yeah, Ed, if I can chime in, part of my point was kind of gets back to Jan's comments about spiking the ball at the 10-yard line. We still have rainy season notwithstanding, we still have all of the water on that facility, and there's momentum to close the entire facility. So even if we have a fairly good rainy season, which is not predicted, there's still a lot of water on that property that eventually needs to go somewhere. And yes, the technology is amazing, and yes, the reduction in loads is amazing, but it's still going to be a significant increase above and beyond ambient.
Yeah, and if they do discharge, it will probably be above the allocation still of that facility, the 0.9 tons per year.
Yeah, and the closure, eventually that closure event is going to take years. So, just again, this is not, hey, we're done, thanks, everybody can go home now.
Yeah, we're certainly not out of the woods yet, for sure. not seeing any other questions or comments in the chat, so please feel free to reach out to us if you did have any questions on what's going on with Piney Point. Like I said, we're continue to coordinate monitoring and provide these monthly status updates as we receive new data from all the partner agencies that are out there collecting this information.
Thanks, Ed. Appreciate the update. Very well done. All right, let's move on to the next agenda item. We're going to get an update from Maya on the private sewer lateral social marketing campaign. Maya?
Yeah, I'll try and step through this relatively quickly, but a lot's been going on this project since the last time I spoke to you all about it. Hopefully you recall, as a result of those large sanitary sewer overflows that occurred in the 2015-2016 time period, the region really identified reducing SSOs and specifically targeting private sewer lateral lines through a social marketing campaign as a priority to pursue as a region. So we put out an RFP and secured a marketing firm, Marketing for Change, to help us do that work. And so today I just kind of want to let you know where we are in terms of the project timeline, and then share with you some of the key research findings and give you a little bit of a teaser for the areas of focus that the campaign will be targeting based on the findings. So we completed all of the research work late last year, and now we've been working on developing some of the campaign creative. So that work is in process right now. We've got some draft creative that we're going to be sharing with the stakeholder committee a little bit later, but we're putting together the paid media plan and a website with our web developer on staff, Joe, and really developing the effectiveness monitoring that we'll be conducting. So identifying those key performance indicators to make sure the campaign is successful, and really putting together all of those materials. So we expect that all those ducks will be sort of lined up for early summer, and then the ad buys will occur over that summer time period, and then in the fall and going into the end of the year, we'll be focused on monitoring the effectiveness of the campaign and then reporting out that information back to you. But this is all about to, heat up and roll out. So I wanted to make sure you all kind of knew it was coming. So in terms of the research as a program, we're committed to being evidence-based, not just in the science and technical work we do, but also in the outreach programs that we pursue. And so we apply rigorous social science to determine and shape the campaigns that we undertake. So for this one, there was a multi-pronged research approach that included both a rapid research review as well as in-depth interviews with a variety of experts from things like plumbers, real estate agents, home inspectors, some of your staffs at utilities, interested citizens, the whole sort of gamut. And then those in-depth interviews, we then rolled over to kind of set up criteria to do a focus group with a variety of different homeowners who met certain criteria. And that was all sort of shaped along the way. There were some challenges, of course, because of COVID. We couldn't do these focus groups in person, so we did employ online technology through a bulletin board focus group in order to do that work. So that bulletin board discussion, really, we were trying to do a few different things. We were trying to figure out who are the most trusted messengers for homeowners to talk to them about their private sanitary sewer laterals. We wanted to know how much they might be willing to pay to inspect or repair or replace their private lateral, and whether or not employing certain policy options like rebates would be helpful in nudging their behavior into the directions that we were looking for. And then we wanted to test several creative concepts with sort of key messaging strategies behind them. So we had 19 homeowners that participated in that focus group, and they all live in houses that were older than 1975, and they fell into, at least one of the categories of considering selling a home, having had a major plumbing emergency, planning to do a major home improvement, recently purchasing a home, or folks that even took advantage of recent government rebates. So the profiles of all of those participants, we really tried to be broad in terms of the coverage and who we were getting, so we didn't bias the results. It was about 50-50 male to female. The age brackets ranged from in the 20s to 69 years old. You had folks who had some college, who were college graduates, and some who had postgraduate education. Again, racial and ethnic spread as well. And again, they covered all those criteria that I mentioned before. And I think it's kind of interesting to note too that about half of the folks that participated in this had already replaced or repaired a sewer line, and half had not. So they were able, that was something that allowed them to have some interesting conversations with each other. In fact, the last day of the focus group, the folks who did have their lateral lines repaired tried to convince the folks who hadn't done that work based on sort of what was compelling to them. And so there were some really interesting exchanges that went on, and we were able to glean some cool insights from that. So these are the core concepts that we tested during the focus groups, and we were really testing different approaches to peace of mind. So wanting folks to get an inspection so they kind of knew what they were dealing with. Targeting things like loss aversion. You want to get a rebate because you don't want to miss out on that, and it'll really make it so that it's not as expensive to deal with this problem. And then also looking at how well things like altruism or environmental appeals, sort of that idea of, if you do this, you can do your part to help save the bay. So what kind of messaging, really worked and was compelling to target and change that behavior about repairing and replacing their private lateral sewer lines. So some of the key findings as a result of the research review, the in-depth interviews, and the focus groups, just stepping through them real quickly. I think we hear this a lot, and it's not always true, but in this case for private sewer laterals, it is true. There's a core knowledge gap. Folks don't know what a sewer lateral is, where it is, or that it's theirs to maintain. And so you'll see here, there's on the screen, there's some quotes from some of those homeowners. But any time that we had included in our messaging something that made that lateral sewer line more salient, so more meaningful to them, it sort of drove home the importance of their responsibility in playing a part in properly maintaining that. So, so that core knowledge gap is something that's really important that we need to sort of build up throughout the region, so folks are more aware of their lateral sewer line. In all of the things that we tested, visuals were really the most important technique that helped people understand what a lateral sewer line is. So for those of you that have already sort of invested in some of these diagrams or video explainers about lateral sewer lines, that's a good line to start on in terms of educating your community about this issue. So those visuals, they increased the sense of urgency, they made it real and personal for them, and it was really likely to inspire some sort of action or interest on their parts. And they were really suspicious of anything that felt like a sales pitch, and this felt just like nothing but the facts to them. And so that unbiased approach was something that in this case was really effective for the homeowners who participated in that focus group. I think none of this is really surprising, but we definitely confirmed a lot of the things that we thought might be the case, that there are a lot of barriers to addressing the lateral sewer line issue. It's part of why we knew it was challenging, but cost, disruption, and fear of the unknown were all really, really important factors that made folks hesitant to even sort of wade in to these kinds of issues. So, they just weren't excited about the potential. They had really some strong imagery in terms of, what their backyard might look like if they had to dig it up, or how hard it would be. Some kind of like fears about going to the doctor, right? Like if you don't know you have a problem, you don't want to go and find out to deal with it. Just like, you kind of build the case against it in your head. And so reducing those barriers will be a really important piece of not only this campaign, but whatever policy options our various local governments might want to pursue in the future to continue to address this issue. So, and speaking of policy options to address the issue, one thing that is not uniformly available throughout the region, although there are several municipalities who have either done pilot rebate programs or in the process of offering pilot rebate programs, that really is something that we were able to confirm holds a lot of potential for moving the needle on this behavior. Loss aversion, if we can tap into that kind of messaging approach and pair it with something like a rebate strategy, we think we can get a lot of movement and traction within the region in terms of addressing private sanitary sewer laterals and the I&I that they contribute to. So I know that there's sort of a lot of questions around whether or not municipalities or counties will be offering those sorts of things, but some things we can tell you is if you did it, you're more likely to knock out part of that I&I problem. And if you can offer an explicit dollar amount, anything that, specific, so not just like a percentage of whatever, but just the more certainty that you could offer a homeowner, the more appealing that sort of approach was. We didn't have as much to go on in terms of that because those policies don't exist. So I want to put out there as an option. For example, I've been working really closely with Pinellas County as they're considering a private sewer lateral ordinance and a various set of policy options to address that. So trying to bring this research to them and help make it applicable and really make their policies as effective as possible. And if any of the local governments in other areas of the watershed are also interested in knowing more about this or using this information to guide any policy discussions around that, I'd also like to offer the estuary program services to help, because that could lead to, sort of like we did with the B Floridian, additional phases of this work where we take different marketing approaches. So people aren't just like looking for more problems, right? So one of the important findings was that you really have to hit people at certain trigger points in order for them to be open to messaging about repairing or replacing their private sanitary sewer laterals. So 2 points in time which they're particularly interested in addressing these issues would be when they're buying a home or if they're experiencing a plumbing backup. And so knowing those points at which, people are more willing to, not just blow you off, but get involved in the behaviors that you're trying to market is important. And so that finding will drive some of the approach that I describe here in a moment. And then for us, is kind of important, without some of the incentive programs in place, we kind of need to know what levers to pull on to be most effective at encouraging the desired behaviors. And so one of our findings was this idea about offering people a sense of control and self-determination over their problems was empowering for them and something that we can lean into in terms of messaging that might be effective. So people don't like the idea of having to call a plumber up on a Sunday or a holiday weekend and being at their mercy, paying exorbitant prices, or feeling like they don't have options. So if you're proactive in dealing with these issues, you can save money and do things sort of more on your own terms. And so that was an important finding as well. So specifically for home buyers, peace of mind, knowing what you're getting into with a home was also something that was compelling. And so that was an important finding in terms of that specific segment of the audience. And it also kind of contributed to that same sense of, again, being in a control position. So you're not at the mercy of someone else, and everything you're getting into that can sometimes lead you to being in a better bargaining position. So when you're conducting a real estate transaction or something like that for a buyer, that's something that can be really important. And so we also asked a lot about trusted intermediaries. I know it's something that we've talked a lot about in this group before. Folks have a lot of ideas about who this messaging should come from. So we talked about a lot of different options with that focus group, and really plumbers and home inspectors, their opinions and their counsel on the matter held the most weight with the homeowner focus groups. And some of that has to do with their expertise. Home inspectors in particular, folks felt like, you know, that idea of they weren't being sold something, you know, a home inspector was just looking out for a buyer's interest, and, you know, again, nothing but the facts, just telling them the house, what they're dealing with, and then it's up to the buyer to decide how they want to proceed. So the trust from those particular recommendations was something that was really valued by the homeowners that participated in the focus groups. There was variability in terms of how people felt about that messaging coming from realtors. Some people did trust their realtors to provide counsel on those topics, especially realtors representing buyers, so buyers agents. And that was something that also came up in those in-depth stakeholder interviews that I discussed. There was, you know, sellers agents were really not interested in being proponents of some of this messaging. They were very concerned about additional regulatory burdens, things that could slow down the transaction process, or even worse, something that could kill a deal. So buyers agents were really not very receptive to a lot of the issues that we were talking about, but buyers agents, in contrast to sellers agents, were more interested and wanted to make sure that they were fully understanding and representing their buyers' best interests in terms of a property transaction. We also asked a little bit about those who didn't have anything to gain monetarily, like city utility workers. We know that many of you have active I&I or flow monitoring projects. You're out there in the field, or you've got water meter readers, you know, people who are sort of in the vicinity and to some extent having those interactions already. Also folks like the estuary program or environmental workers. So we asked them a little bit about all of those things, and I think that the homeowners generally thought that those folks were trustworthy, but the impact of those recommendations wasn't as strong from their perspective as homeowners. So there's perhaps some opportunity there, but maybe not the biggest bang for the buck. So based on all of that information, you know, we really started to key in on this issue of, you know, which intermediaries might be the most beneficial to work with. We learned a lot in terms of the Be Floridian campaign about working with retailers who sell fertilizer products, and then also landscaping professionals. And I think that that's been a way that we've enhanced the effectiveness of that campaign. And so that was a lesson that we wanted to apply here if it made sense. And in general, what we found is that really home inspectors are pretty appealing in terms of an intermediary to work with. They are licensed. Some of those home inspectors are already offering like sewer scoping inspections as part of their their regular suite of services. We have a really active professional association that meets regularly, and we have opportunities to tap into some of that work. So, for example, we're planning to present at the FOBI conference in June, and they're already part of that home buying process, which we've identified as an important trigger when people are particularly receptive to messaging about private sanitary sewer lateral maintenance. And they generally have relationships with plumbers. So if they don't offer the inspections themselves, they have like a handful of plumbers that they work with that they know do offer those services and can make recommendations for homeowners to link up that way. We had a very difficult time getting plumbers to participate in our work. We offered, I think, like $100 for 30 minutes of their time for those stakeholder interviews. Their professional association hasn't been meeting regularly. It's just been really kind of difficult to tap into. So they're harder to reach generally as a group, so that would be more difficult for us to be effective, but they are an important piece of this puzzle. And so we think that because homeowners have some of those, home inspectors, excuse me, have some of those relationships, that if we can sort of use that side door to get to them, that might work. But because plumbers are generally trusted as experts and, you know, are there that are going to be doing the work, they are going to be an important piece of all of that. And then again, like I've kind of been alluding to, while realtors are already part of the home buying process, which is that key trigger that we're interested in, they're not uniformly willing to advocate for lateral line inspections unless they're representing the buyer. So if they're seller's agents, they're not super on board. And they're also generally like very politically active and have strong opinions about what ought to go into real estate transactions from a regulatory perspective. And so generally they were really apprehensive about any sort of command and control regulated approach to dealing with these things. So this is something, again, they're part of that transaction, but there's opportunities for more of like an education or soft touch kind of approach rather than really digging in. So things we could offer would be like some optional sample language to include in real estate contracts that addresses this. So if they wanted to use it, they have those resources, but we're not necessarily sparking a strong backlash to the campaign. So in terms of backlash, that was something that's actually really important, and I want to hammer it home for you all. So government mandated requirements, they really do carry with it a risk of immediate turnoff and losing people in terms of getting their buy-in for this kind of work. So there's this concept of reactance, and essentially you want to be really careful about how you talk about all of these things in terms of where responsibility is laid. It needs to be jointly shared, and really you need to tread upon this idea lightly, because the idea that you could require something on somebody's personal property and not provide a rebate or anything like that was just very off-putting to the homeowners. And again, a lot of them, when you told them that it was their responsibility, they're like, my piece is so small, there's no way if my pipe was leaking, it's not getting to the bay. I live 2 miles from there. You're dumping hundreds of millions of gallons into the bay. What's my little piece, in comparison? And these, I think you still can see some of these. They're very much top of mind for residents still. And although I know everyone's been doing a lot of work on these topics, that messaging that hasn't really trickled down in the same way. So you ought to be very careful not to spark reactance. And so again, carrots are pretty important here, and that soft touch and understanding what kind of messages to appeal to in terms of letting them provide a sense of control are really important, particularly when we're looking at a policy landscape that is for these kind of voluntary approaches to lateral repair and replacement. Finally, I think we all in this room, we love the Bay. A lot of what we do is for the Bay, and people do love the Bay. But that environmental messaging, again, we showed that it's actually not motivating. Yes, people cared, but it didn't really make their bottom line. It was more about their pocketbook or some of these other things. And even I think 1 or 2 people you see here on the side, it's a little guilt trippy. So I think it felt like a pitch to them, and so I think that any kind of products that come out of this need to walk that fine line in terms of really where to focus in terms of what's a behavioral determinant for folks interested in the issue. So the marketing plan that we are putting together now is really pulling all of those research findings and looking to apply them. So like I mentioned, we are planning to really focus this phase of the campaign on those 2 decision points, primarily on real estate transactions, largely because it's an opportunity for us right now. The market is really hot. There's a lot of properties that are moving. And so that's an opportunity for us to target people who are looking to buy homes and make sure that they're primed and ready for lateral messaging. We also want to work to make the business case to those intermediaries, really focused on home inspectors primarily, but also some ancillary materials that can be used for plumbers and realtors to make lateral sewer line inspections, so those camera scoping inspections, easier for folks to find and to get. And so again, this is because it's a voluntary approach right now based on the policies that are in place throughout the watershed. But we think that, you know, doing that work, if you know you have a problem, that's the first step to getting something done about it. And so we want to make that particular getting an inspection activity easier. We also want to help amplify the messaging of many of our partners to increase the saliency of lateral sewer lines by developing video explainers. I know many of you have done some of that work, but we want to take another slice at it and provide some of that imagery that you could also use and co-brand with your respective government logos and things like that. And then, like I mentioned, we do think that rebates would be a really, or some sort of financial incentive would be an important piece of the strategy to get people to undertake this behavior. And so I'm available to work with your elected officials and decision makers if you're interested in pursuing a private laterals ordinance or any policy options that could put those things in place. I think we have some really strong social science research that supports those sorts of activities. So our audience, we are looking at targeting prospective home buyers, specifically folks that are trying to buy homes built before 1975, people who are currently owning homes that are built before 1975, so those key intermediaries that I talked about. We also have zip codes for those of you that have done flow metering or otherwise identified I&I hotspots, and so we're using those zip codes to help target some of our ad buys as well. Like I mentioned, some of the assets and challenges that we're facing, we have good coordination through the estuary program for all of our partner local governments. We have an active and organized home inspector and realtor or home inspector association that we can tap into. We know we've got an active real estate market to work with, so that kind of makes sense for us. Good ideas about where the laterals might be leaking, and we do have folks that are offering those scope inspections. So we're working on, building on the strengths that we have as a region, but then also targeting some of those challenges specifically that we identified there. And I think I've covered most of these points, so I don't really want to be redundant. But the main things that we're going to be doing is an ad buy for home buyers, design collateral like brochures and things like that for the intermediaries like home inspectors, and then a website that sort of takes those two key audiences and synthesizes all that information there. And all of the campaign materials will also be available on that website on the TBEP page, so that just like Be Floridian, you'll be able to download that information and purpose it with your logos and things like that as well, so you all can use all of the work that's designed. And then again, any help supporting policy options that your governments might want to consider. I feel like I've covered all this. So that's where we're at. It's really heating up. We're getting close. Stuff will be rolling out this summer. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
You had a couple in the chat. Ryan Rizik and Michelle Holton were mentioning the grease and flushables as issues in tandem with the sanitary sewer overflows. Can you kind of speak to that, where our messaging campaign fits in with the other?
So we're currently, we've heard that from some of the stakeholders in our utility stakeholder group. And so Joe Whalen has been putting together an inventory kind of documenting what work has been done on fogs and non-flushables to see if we could offer some coherent messaging around those topics as well. But I really want to emphasize for Pinellas County, at least, who I've been working most closely with just because they're considering these options now, as much as 70% of the I&I is attributable to lateral sewer lines or sanitary sewer overflows is attributable to I&I. So that's whether it's on the public side or the private side. Grease, so fog, non-flushables is a relatively low percentage, like I think less than 5% that's contributing to those sanitary sewer overflows. So I think it's not as much of an issue, and it's one where the messaging is already, I think, more coherently covered. So we're looking to see if we can kind of help out on that, but I think that the data really do push to This is a hard nut to crack, and it's a bigger contributor to your sanitary sewer overflows. So yes, they're both important, but I feel after seeing all that data, I felt a lot more confident dealing with the lateral sewers for this campaign. So.
The other comments were from Susan Huckley from Bradenton, trying to make analogies with other utilities that are maintained on the properties. I don't know if she wants to unmute and elaborate or ask a specific question on that. She was, I think, just suggesting to make that connection with homeowners, that proper maintenance of your phone cable modem lines should be viewed similarly as your private laterals and sewer systems.
I appreciate that thought, and we'll take it back. Thanks.
Thank you, Maya, for the update. Let's go ahead and move on to our next item. Ryan with Pinellas County is going to give us a quick update on the reclaimed water mapping tool. Ryan?
Okay, I'm trying to share screen here. Do you have to give me permission to share screen?
I do. I'm working on it right now.
Okay. And you see it?
Not yet.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Let me move this stuff over. All right. So on our website right here, can you see that? Sorry, it's not showing me what you're seeing, so I have no idea.
Yeah, we can see you. Right.
Okay, showing my website, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So on the website at pinellascounty.org/fertilizer, we have this map over here, which we're working on language that direct people to it on the website, of the reclaimed water areas in Pinellas County. So when you click on that map, it opens up into this big screen, and it has each reclaimed water region where you can get your reclaim from. And then when you click on your area, it'll give you the source of the reclaimed water, help you, hone in on where you're getting your reclaim from. It'll give you the annual concentration, average concentration. It'll give you the loading and things like that you may need, especially for bigger users like golf courses and things like that would be able to use that information. But for homeowners, we kind of simplified it to basically a recommendation of how much more fertilizer you would put down in relation to what's recommended by University of Florida, capped at our 4 pounds per year limit on our ordinance. And so, and these numbers are basically those ranges on that recommendation of how much nitrogen per year you would put down in addition to what was there. So that's how that's calculated. About every year or two, we update these numbers. We get the numbers from the reclaim from the water treatment plants and update them. But this is the maximum additional fertilizer you would add, and that would be based on the midpoint of those nutrient recommendations. So, like for example, here Bahia is 1 to 3 pounds per year is recommended by University of Florida, and then so Bahia down here, additionally, you would add 2.7, and that's compensating for that nutrient in a regular watering schedule that's calculated out how much nutrients would be in that reclaimed water. So you click around, it'll be different areas. You get down to St. Pete, and you see there's a 0 because they have so much nutrients in water, you don't have to fertilize at all if you're using reclaim. So it just depends on where you're getting your reclaim one, how much water, how much more additional fertilizer you would need to put down for the recommended midpoint is what we calculated it as. So that's based on the background for the. So for those numbers, we put in Rob Burns came up with this calculator, so we can just input the milligrams per liter. It'll automatically calculate out based on that normal watering schedule, And I believe that was done on twice a week watering. I think it was an inch or 3/4 of an inch per watering is what it's calculated out to be. And so that's what those recommendations are based on, to kind of simplify it for them. So on this chart, it calculates that out and then gives the recommendations. We put the min and the max for the recommended grass type from the University of Florida Extension. And then we capped it at 4. So Bermuda, for example, goes over 4 per the recommendations of the University of Florida, but our ordinance caps it at 4. So we can left it there. Everything else is below the cap of 4, so there's no problem with the other grass types there. And so we just did that as a simple way to people know how to adjust their fertilizations of their yards in accordance to what their reclaims putting out in those areas. Let's see. So it's been interesting trying to get information for St. Pete because they've changed their plants and some that's connected and things like that. But actually in the St. Pete area, we get the numbers for each plant. And you can see here, it's separated by plant. So when you go back to the map, each plant type would be a little bit different numbers, but the end result's the same because they're all really high. It'd be 0 application of fertilizer in St. Pete if you're using reclaim on a regular basis. And so we also have a flyer that we developed. So we're doing education events and things like that. Basically just screenshots of this put onto a Word document that we print out and hand out to people. So they have the instant information there and they just look at that flyer about how much they should be putting down for fertilizer and compensating for those loads. Let's see. That's really about it. I mean, it's pretty simple. You just take that each year or two to update that. It doesn't change a whole lot. Those averages, they stay pretty consistent unless they make a major change of the plant or something like that. It doesn't change a whole lot because it is an annual average. It's pretty level. Outside of that, I think that's really it. It's a straightforward application. If you have any questions, I'm open to those.
So Ryan, part of what I thought was, I mean, I thought this was just like a cool tool to put out there in general. But this has been an ongoing conversation with this group, sort of better understanding the nutrient loading from reclaimed water and how to nest that into the allocations for non-point sources. But I also know that DEP is interested in potentially developing this tool statewide, and so I thought it would be useful for the group to just kind of see how it was piloted in Pinellas County and understand that it might be also coming for all the counties in our region.
Yeah, we recently added the concentration and the loading on there, and that was for the golf courses in conversations with them last year and implementing their proper fertilization practices for our ordinance. That was added so they could compensate and get those numbers because they had I got calls from them saying it's hard for them to get those numbers out of our utilities. I don't know why. They try, sometimes even I have a hard time. They want to keep them secret for some reason. I have no idea why when it's public information. Some of them have it on the website. Some of them keep it secret. And a couple I had a real hard time even getting it out of them. They're like, ask me 20 questions like, why do you want this information? What are you using it for? It's like, it's public information. I'm like, well, I don't get it. But anyway, so, some of the golf courses wanted that information and weren't able to get it. So that's when I added the concentration of loadings on there to make it easier for them to calculate since they're fertilizing different than a homeowner would, obviously. That way they can just do their own calculations on adjusting their fertilization rates.
Rich Gardner said it looks like maybe the Marshall Street plant from Clearwater is missing in the spreadsheet.
Oh, is there? Is it a separate system?
I didn't see it on the spreadsheet that you were pulling up there.
Okay. Let me pull up the spreadsheet. Maybe we missed that one.
You got east and northeast, but I didn't see Marshall Street unless it's somewhere else.
I don't think we have that one on.
Brian, what has been the reaction of homeowners to it? Have they understood what it's telling them? Is there?
Yeah, generally, I mean, we did it during education events, and they kind of understand what we're getting at, how well they're implementing it. I don't know on that end, but they were surprised to know that they need to adjust their fertilizer, and they did get that education. They seem to be taking it in as far as they should be taking that into account.
It seems like there's oftentimes you have to like spoon feed that information, and if they had like an idea of the size of the yard, then you could tell them specifically how many bags of fertilizer you should be adding throughout the year.
Right, but that's the problem because yards, most of the time they have no idea what size their yard is.
Yeah.
I mean, average around here is probably about 1 to 5,000 square feet. Also depends on what concentration of nitrogen fertilizer you're using, It could be anywhere from, 6 to 26 or, whatever, nitrogen. So that makes a difference as well. And I do have conversations with them when I did have events about that and be like, well, how much fertilizer did we down? I don't know. I just put the whole bag down. It's like, how do you know it's the right amount? It's like you maybe go a couple of fertilizations out of that instead of wasting your money, And I talked to more of that at that end about, using it wisely, using it as needed, and not necessarily wasting their money, and that sort of thing. Go from that angle as it's beneficial to them and the environment. They use it in the proper way, and they adjust it. And you can still have a plenty green lawn and nice lawn by doing the proper application, as opposed to just not paying attention to how much you're putting down.
So Chris Claus asked how pest control and fertilizer companies have responded. Have you gotten any feedback from them?
I haven't got any feedback from them on this at all. I don't know if we really pushed it out to them, but that's a good idea though. I don't know if we did when we first created it. We may have. It was 7 years ago now, I think, when we created it. And it's kind of hard to remember back that far. They've done so much stuff. So we may have back then. I believe we probably did. I know some of them do account when they're mixing their tanks for the amount of nitrogen in the mixed water when they're using reclaim.
And Tom's asked if there's information on when reclaimed may be coming to a given neighborhood.
I don't know about that. That'd be utilities. You just have to contact Pinellas County Utilities or whatever utility provider that is. It's just many different ones throughout the county. So you just would have to contact them and see when that's going to occur. I haven't seen a whole lot lately about that being done in any existing neighborhoods. They kind of come to new developed neighborhoods, but not necessarily existing so much, because then you got to work around infrastructure that's already there. And I think that's kind of a deterrent in some ways to future expansion, because a lot of them are pretty close to the edge of what they need taken anyway, at least for our systems in North County especially, we actually have pressure issues and things like that. So I don't think they're really expanding too much except for new development.
And just so everyone knows, Scott Browning shared that Manatee County has posted similar information, like with a table that cross-references the watering frequency with amounts of nitrogen. And then he posted the link in the chat for anybody who's interested.
Cool.
I don't see anything else, but thank you for sharing that, Ryan. I appreciate it.
Oh, I have one quick question. Whoever commented about the Marshall Street in Clearwater, would it be included in this green area that's here, or it'll be a separate area that's outside the areas we've indicated?
No, it's in the green area.
Okay, would it be this north one?
No, that would be the northeast plant, which is on
Okay,
your.
we'll have to figure out where that area is so we can separate it somehow.
Yeah, if you want to send me an email or give me a call, I'll help you.
Okay.
That was Rich Gardner, Ryan.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, let's move on to our 2020 aerial seagrass mapping results with Chris.
Hey, everybody. Thank you. I just want to make sure y'all are seeing the correct screen. Are you seeing the title slide okay?
Yep.
Yes, sir.
All right, perfect. So yeah, thanks for inviting me to come and talk about the 2020 seagrass mapping results. We are very close to the final release of these numbers. So for those of you who attended the Seagrass Working Group meeting, those were preliminary results. Now we're up to the draft final, and we're hoping that within the next few days, the draft will go away and these will be final numbers. So what I'm going to do today is just kind of go through an overview of what our seagrass mapping program is, and then really just kind of focus mostly on the results for Tampa Bay. Just to refamiliarize those of you who are not familiar with the program, it is part of a larger effort that the district's been doing since 1988. We map the areas from just east of Cedar Key and Wackasassa Bay all the way down to Charlotte Harbor. We basically split it up into two areas. We have the Springs Coast, which is that northern area from Cody River north, and then from Tampa Bay south, we call the Sun Coast region. So all the estuaries and up in the north, the offshore coastal water areas up to about 25 miles offshore is what we presently map. We map the Springs Coast on a 4-year cycle, and the Sun Coast is on a 2-year cycle and has been since about 1988. I'm not going to go into detail on the overall project timeline, just want to highlight a couple of things. Number one is the numbers that you're going to see today are from aerial photo acquisition that took place between November 19 and February 2020. I know that's kind of a long time ago now, but it's a pretty involved process to turn those images into maps. And of course, this past year, we had the added challenge of COVID and being able to operate and do the things that we needed to do in a COVID environment. That coupled with the fact that we knew we were going to see losses this year, and so we wanted to take extra time and go out in the field and really collect enough data to give as much confidence to the map as possible. Pushed our schedule a little bit beyond what we normally would release these maps, which is typically around March. But here we are end of May and we're still in the draft phase. But like I said, we're hoping to get the final numbers and the shape files posted to our website next week. So there's basically 3 phases to our mapping program. There's the acquisition phase, there's the photo interpretation phase, and the field verification phase. And acquisition obviously comes first. Field verification happens throughout the life cycle of the mapping, and then of course the photo interpretation is what results in the actual maps themselves. So acquisition, like I showed you on the timeline, the flight window is from November to February. And there's a bunch of reasons why we do it at that time. It's obviously not the optimal time to map seagrass because they tend to go dormant over the winter season, but the atmospheric conditions and the sea conditions are best at that time of the year. And so we do have a strict set of go, no go criteria for flight. Weather plays obviously a big role, as do tides. And during that acquisition window, we do almost daily water clarity monitoring using a Secchi disc. And there's several of you here today at this meeting that were intimately involved in that process. So I want to give a huge shout out to all those folks that volunteered to collect those Secchi disc measurements, because it's a really critical part of deciding on whether or not we go or no go for flight. And that happens really on a daily basis. And so we're on the phone with the pilots, flight crew, and the PIs, and we're kind of working through that every morning to decide, okay, are we good or are we not good? So it's a pretty intensive process. And so for those of you who did volunteer for the 2020 effort, 22 efforts coming up, flight window starts this November. So I'll probably be knocking on your door here soon to get that lined up. The other thing about the acquisition that's important is the post-processing. So these imagery are collected for the sole purpose of mapping seagrass. So there's a lot of color balancing, pixel stretching, edge matching, a whole bunch of stuff that happens to these images before they are finally mosaicked together into one image. If you've looked at our seagrass imagery, you'll notice that it doesn't look like a normal image, and that's because a lot of that post-processing occurs in order to make the bottom features more visible. So it's really, again, specific to mapping seagrass and other bottom types. The other thing I wanted to touch on, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the field verification piece, but I do want to stress the importance of it. And so there's really 3 levels of field verification. There's what we would call the photo interpreter's ground truth. Then we do QC spot checks, which are typically driven by us, the district. And then there's an independent accuracy assessment, which is what's done at the very end of the mapping cycle in order to verify that the map meets the accuracy standards that we require. The PI ground truth really happens across the entire cycle, the life cycle of the mapping project. And it's specifically designed to address questions that the photo interpreters have regarding image signatures. And that's current images, but also imagery from previous years. So there are areas we know we always have problems with. For example, passes are always a big issue because you've got a lot of turbidity that goes back and forth. Not so much an issue in Tampa Bay, but when you get down into places like Sarasota Bay and Charlotte Harbor and Lemon Bay, that can be an issue. So the photo interpreters will go out, they will look at areas in order to verify the signatures that they see or expect to see in those areas. For the Suncoast estuaries from Tampa Bay to Charlotte Harbor, the PIs collected about 903 data points. And this is true across all three of those field verification types. We're using Survey 123 as our app of choice. We've, for the most part, standardized the type of data that are being collected: presence, absence, dominant species, attached algae. There's a whole suite of parameters that are collected and input into Survey 123. The other thing that's becoming more and more common and is really becoming a cornerstone of our field verification process is underwater video logging. So we do that in all three of these field verification efforts. And that's for a couple of reasons. For the PIs, it's important because what they do is they take those videos back to the office and they actually do their analysis in the office using those videos. The other reason this is really important is it creates a permanent record that then, 5, 6, 7, 10 years from now, people can go back to and look and see exactly what those areas look like. So it's becoming a very important part of our field verification. I mentioned the QC spot checks a little bit. This happens now at the very end of the mapping cycle, and it's driven largely by us, the district. This is data collection that happens. We started doing our spot checks back in December, November of last year. Again, challenging with COVID, but we were able to overcome that limitation and get out in the field. And what this does is it really provides some fine tuning of the map. So we've got draft maps in hand, we're looking at them, we're analyzing the line work. And in areas where we think there's some issues, we will go out and we'll do these spot checks. Sometimes we do that with the photo interpreters, sometimes we do it without. We also go out with our partners. So we've been out with the estuary program, we've been out with Sarasota County, with the aquatic preserve staff down in Charlotte Harbor, and we'll go out with our partners in order to verify some of areas that they have concerns with as well. So this is a really important part of the field verification process. And then the last one is the independent accuracy assessment. So we sampled over 1,200 points across our mapped area during this cycle. It is based on a random stratified design, so there are some statistics that go along with this. And the actual data collection occurs during aerial acquisition and or shortly after. Now with COVID, the intent was to get it done by March of 2020, but we ran into about May, I think maybe even early June timeframe. But the idea is we want to get these field data points as soon as possible during or after the images were collected, because as you all know, these habitat types change over seasons and over time. Same thing with the independent accuracy assessment. They're using Survey 123. And they're using underwater video logs as well to record those locations that they're at. What we do is we do the final accuracy assessment, which is happening right now. And what we're looking for is a 90% accuracy acceptance for the final map product. The photo interpretation, I just want to touch really quick on because these are maps based on photographic signatures. So these are image signatures that the photo interpreters are looking at, and based on their expertise and the field verification are able to, and previous maps as well, are able to make these maps possible. So what we do is we use these modified Flux mapping conventions, and I'm just going to touch on 3 of them, really 4 of them. We do map more. As those of you who are familiar with our maps, we do have more Flux codes than just these, but these are the ones I want to focus on because these are the ones that really most people pay attention to, which is the Seagrass codes of continuous and patchy, and the 9121, which is attached algae. And this is going to become really important when you see the maps here in a few minutes. I do want to stress though that drift algae is not mapped by convention. So if it's a drift type algae like Gracilaria, we don't map it. We can see it, but we don't map it. And the reason why we don't is because we only map every 2 years, and drift algae by definition drifts. So we don't typically map that. But we do annotate it in our field verification data. So we do have that information. I wanted to just touch on each of these quickly. The continuous seagrass coverage class is 9116. The reason I'm showing you this slide is because it's important to realize when we look at the maps and you see a nice green polygon that's continuous, it's important to note that continuous doesn't imply the image that you see in the top right. Continuous can be any one of these images. So there's a spectrum of how the quality of the grass is relative to what the image signature looks like. So a continuous signature exhibits basically a uniform pattern. You can have less than 1/4 acre sandy bottom features. They might be interspersed within the bed, but it's basically a uniform signature. But again, that doesn't necessarily imply quality. So it could be any one of these pictures. And so as you know, you can go into a continuous bed and there may be a lot of epiphytes on those leaves. There may be a lot of drift algae mixed in. So just keep that in mind when you see the maps and you see continuous. It doesn't always mean this beautiful lush grass bed. It could be, you know, a bed of grass that really isn't doing that well, but it's still continuous. Same thing with patchy. So you can see here, these 4 panels kind of show you the spectrum of what a patchy seagrass meadow may look like. And there's 2 ways to think about patchy. Patchy in kind of the more traditional sense is just that. They're singular kind of rounded clumps or elongated strands of isolated, you know, patches of seagrass. But they could also be sparse grasses. So these are areas which are typically less than 25% coverage of what we would consider uninterrupted seagrass. And again, remember, this is based on the imagery, which was collected around 9,000 feet. That's where that's the altitude that the aircraft flies. So imagine yourself at 9,000 feet looking down at the bay. And when we say up to 25% coverage, it doesn't mean 25% of a particular quadrat toss. It's 25% at 9,000 feet. Same thing with attached algae. This one is when you think of attached algae, typically in Tampa Bay, especially, you think of Caulerpa proliferans, and that's what you see on the left-hand side of this slide. Typically, to be in this classification, you have to be a pretty dominant stand of attached algae. So there's not those thick beds of Caulerpa that many have seen in Tampa Bay. Sometimes they do coexist with seagrass beds, but again, we're looking for the dominant signature being attached algae versus seagrass. And again, this can also follow a continuum from these really healthy, clean beds of Caulerpa proliferans to something that you see like on the right-hand side of the screen. And then the last one I'm going to talk about here, which I've kind of mixed in with 9121, is what we're calling a composite colonized algae. This is a classification that typically we see in the Springs Coast, where you get a lot of mosaic habitat types of seagrass. It might be a Halophila seagrass mixed with some Caulerpa, and then you get a lot of sponges and different types of coral. So it's kind of an amalgam. But if the signature on the image kind of indicates that the bulk of it is attached algae with some of these other sponges and other things like corals, then it would go into a 9122. Where we do see this in Tampa Bay, and we've seen it now for several years, is in lower Tampa Bay. So down close to Terracea is where you'll see this 9122. I'm not going to show you this one. That when you look at the numbers, the total numbers, just remember that 9122 is mixed in with the 9121. It comes to about 350 acres total for Tampa Bay. So it's not a very large component of the overall algae, attached algae signature, but it is there. So I wanted to mention it to you. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the results. So let's look at Tampa Bay. Let's go back to 2018 real quick. So this is 2018. The map on the left again shows you the 9113, which is the patchy, 9116, which is continuous, and then that 9121/9122, which is the attached algae. So think Caulerpa proliferans when you think attached algae for Tampa Bay. And so you could see the long-term trend from 1982 to 2018, a steady rise, bit of a drop from 16 to 18. We had about close to a 3% drop in grass between 16 to 18 overall. Now let's fast forward to 2020. So in 2020, we saw a significant drop in seagrass of about, we have mapped a total of about 34,300 acres of seagrass across the various base segments. One thing to note, and I'm going to go back real quick to the 18, if you focus on Old Tampa Bay, you'll see those green polygons go to this bluish green color, this 9121. So you're basically going from 9116, 9113 to 9121. I'm going to talk more about that in a second, but I just wanted to focus your eyes on Old Tampa Bay and also Hillsborough Bay. The reason being that when you look at the percent change, and I will say that the map on the left, the loss is not the most current loss. So we did an update this week. So some of the maps are a little bit dated. I didn't have time to update this one. But in general, it just shows you the locations where we saw the greatest loss from 18 to 20. But if you look at both the change in acres and the percent change, the big drop and what's really driving the majority of the loss in Tampa Bay is Old Tampa Bay. So we lost about 38% cover from 18 to 20, which is a little over 4,000 acres. That's a significant loss. Hillsborough Bay, from a percent change standpoint, lost about 43%. Most of that loss was along the western shore, along Bay Shore. And then we also saw some additional loss in the kitchen, mainly along the deep edge. So there was a loss of that deep edge along the kitchen, and that's where most of that loss occurred. You know, overall, from a bay-wide perspective, Hillsborough Bay, we're only talking 600 acres change, but still that represents a large percent change for that bay segment. Middle Tampa Bay as well, it only had an 11% change from 18 to 20, but still that represents 1,000 acres, which is significant. What I want to do though now is I really want to focus on Old Tampa Bay because again, that's what's driving the majority of this trend. And I want to focus on Old Tampa Bay going back to that 9121 classification because what we're seeing and what we saw in Old Tampa Bay is not just a loss in grass, but a conversion or a switch from mostly grass to mostly attached algae. So the table below shows where you've had almost a one-to-one conversion of seagrass to attached algae. And again, the majority of that attached algae in Old Tampa Bay is Caulerpa proliferans. So this photograph on the right shows you, is a good example of what a Caulerpa bed would look like in Old Tampa Bay. The hump, which is that feather sound area, large stands of Caulerpa. We went out with Gary and a couple of folks from the estuary program. We looked at that area, also the area north of the Courtney Camel Causeway. A lot of Caulerpa in areas that were mapped in 2018 as seagrass. And this isn't something that just happened all of a sudden. So one thing that we've been working on is developing time series of looking back on the imagery, the historical imagery, and sort of trying to piece together the successional story of what might be happening in some of these areas. So this is an example right on the hump in Feather Sound of a portion of that area where you can see from 2008 to 2020, sort of this expansion of these Caulerpa beds. So in 2008, the majority of that area was sand, some patchy seagrass, which is those kind of gray or they're sort of greenish subdued colors. The darker dots that you see, that stippled pattern, that's the Caulerpa. And in 2010, you can see it starts to expand. 2014, it's really well mixed with the grass. 16, you're sort of seeing it morph a little bit. 16 was the record year across the period from 88 to 2016 for seagrass in Tampa Bay. So more seagrass than algae. 2018, you start to see it again, kind of infiltrating the seagrass beds, and then 2020, it's almost entirely chlorpa beds. The reason why I wanted to bring this up was because, the maps tend to give you the idea that this change just happened immediately. But because our mapping conventions are based on percent cover, based on these photographic signatures, it's important to look at the imagery, because the imagery tells a much deeper story than just looking at the maps and the numbers in 2018 and 2020. So this isn't something that just happened overnight, I guess is my point. It's something that has been occurring over time, but now in 2020, the percent cover or the signature of chlorpa has overwhelmed the signature of grass, and so now it's being as 9121 as opposed to 9113 and 9116, which are the seagrass classifications. The other thing I wanted to stress too is the importance of not only the field verification data that we collect as part of our seagrass mapping program, but also the data that our partners collect. So the graphic on the bottom of this slide is a graphic showing you the seagrass transect data from 2017 to 2020. So we use these transects to further validate what we were seeing. And when we saw this change in the hump, we were very fortunate to have this, which I believe is one of the longest transects that we have in Tampa Bay. And we were able to look at these transect data, which gives us a much deeper dive as to what's going on in this area. And what you can see in that graphic on the bottom of the slide is a pretty clear transition, which again kind of validates what I just showed you in the previous slide, where in 2017, most of the transect was reported as seagrass. And as you progress to 18, 19, and then 20, you see this progression from those pinkish circles to the purplish circles, which means you're going from seagrass to attached algae, chlorpa. The other thing that's important about this graphic is the lines that you see between the years. So the little airplane represents when we flew. So we're flying in the winter. These data are being collected in August, September timeframe. So in the summer or towards the end of the growing season. Different story, but same pattern. And that's really important. That again, further validates that what we're seeing isn't a seasonal phenomenon, but it's more of a long-term trend. So just wanted to summarize what I just presented to you. So again, between 2018 and 2020, we lost about 16% of our seagrass habitat in Tampa Bay. That translates to about 6,300 acres. That puts us back about 10 years. So if you look at the acreage in 2010, it's a little bit less than what we reported in 2020. So, we're down back to where we were about 10 years ago. Old Tampa Bay by far is the one bay segment that stands out as the one that had the greatest loss, not only loss, but change from seagrass to chlorpa. So that's very significant too, that it's not just a loss that went to bare sand, it's a loss of seagrass replaced with chlorpa. Hillsborough Bay is also one to watch because although the acreage was relatively small, a 43% loss is significant. We think that could have had something to do with Hurricane Irma and I guess what you would call the anti-surge, all that water that kind of drained out of Hillsborough Bay. The one thing too that's of good news is that we saw minor losses in Boca Ciega Bay and Teresilla Bay, and lower Tampa Bay essentially was unchanged. We saw a percent change of 0.8%, which is really within the noise of the map. Anything really less than 5% is noise in the map. So good news, I guess, to take away from this is that we really didn't see major losses, if any, in the lower portions of the bay. Of course, with Piney Point, we have to really keep our eyes on lower Tampa Bay, because that is the one bay segment where we didn't see much, if any, change at all. So with that, I just want to again thank all the partners. This is by no means an exhaustive list of folks that help us, but really without partners like the Estuary Program, the counties, the state, we couldn't do this work. So I do want to thank everyone. And this is my contact information, so I'm happy to talk one-on-one or offline with anybody in detail about these maps. And again, I appreciate your patience in getting these maps out. I know we were shooting for mid-May. It's going to be June now, next week, but we are days away from getting these maps released to the public. So hang in there. We're close at this point. So with that, I don't know if we have any questions, Maya, but I'm happy to answer any questions at this time.
Yeah, and I figured there'd be some discussion around this topic. But before I get to Ryan's comment or question, I just wanted to mention to you, Chris, I think when Aaron was still doing the mapping for the last one, the 2018 numbers, you know, that was the speculation that Hurricane Irma and the anti-surge, you know, drove that initial loss. I don't know if that's really as much for the continuing loss for the next 2 years or not. I wonder if you can weigh in on that, or if it's maybe just like it's been wetter and that's getting more freshwater inflow, and so maybe that's what's going on up there.
Yeah, I mean, it's really complicated, and I hate to speculate. I think, you know, it's important that we are careful, that we don't just, you know, speculate on what might be going on. You know, remember the 18 maps were flown in November of 17 through February, and I can't remember the exact dates that Tampa Bay was flown. I think it was December of 17. So Irma came in September. There could have been some impact from the hurricane. It's hard to say really, but I do think you touched on rainfall. I do think that's a major driver. Again, yes, I am being a bit speculative here, but I mean, we all know that around that 2015 timeframe is when we started to see a return to what we would consider more normal rainfall. And so that may have had and may be having an impact. It will be very interesting to see what happens with the 22 maps, and you know, if we've kind of bottomed out, if we're going to see some recovery. But I think the takeaway from this mapping effort for me is that shift from Seagrass to Callirpa. I think that's a real tell. Not sure exactly what it tells us, but you know, the fact that you know, Old Tampa Bay seems to be the hotspot of this, and you know, we know tracking water quality that the water quality hasn't been as good. We've had those persistent those persistent pyridinium blooms. There's something going on Old Tampa Bay. So I think this just validates what we already knew and puts numbers on that.
Yeah, and I think I've said this to you, but I'll just say it to others too. I did notice the transects that I did in Hillsborough Bay, kind of going down into a little part of Middle Tampa Bay, more halophila in the bay than I've seen in the past, which maps different, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, because you know, we don't map to species, but there's no question our field data confirms that as well, that Hillsborough Bay, there's a lot of halophila there that we didn't see in previous years. So there may be something going on there as well. But yeah, we don't map to species, which is why the transects are so important, because that actually gives us a lot more indication. And it also helps make a better map, because the PIs use that data and they compare that transect data to the signature, and they can tell the difference between halophila and, let's say, Thalassia, haliduli, and Syringodium, just because of the unique shape of the leaf and the color, you know, reflection that it gives off is different.
Brian, do you want to ask your question or make your comment?
Yes. So, you know, I've been basically out in that same area of Upper Tampa Bay, Old Tampa Bay area, sampling both, you know, seagrass, that long transect, and water quality since 2006, almost every year. just from my own observation, I was curious as to whether the duck population that comes in every winter may be a grazing issue causing this, because I've noticed the population getting larger and larger. And the last year I was out there, it was huge. I mean, the biggest flock I've ever seen. It covered almost all of upper Tampa Bay, and they tend to stick to these areas where you're seeing this chlorpa, and I'm wondering if that may have an impact on that change, because I've seen the flocks get larger and larger, and the last year was the largest. Year before last, I think it was, when I was out there. I mean, the whole upper Tampa Bay was like nothing but ducks. Wow. And like when we went out there, the whole upper Tampa lifted off the water. The whole sky was just filled with ducks. It must have been hundreds of thousands. I mean, it was huge. And I noticed that increase, and it kind of correlates the increase you're seeing in the algae. Maybe one goes hand in hand out there grazing the grass more, and so the proliferation grows a little faster and it's overtaking it. Just some options to look at. The other thing I noticed was more algae bloom issues in that Largo Inlet area. Some strain ones I've seen the last, it was 2018 or 19, that we haven't seen before. That's kind of new since, I've been working at the county here since 2006, and that was new to me, and I haven't heard of any other issues like that in the area to that level previously.
Interesting. What did you say? What time of the year that you saw that?
It's late fall, early winter, I believe, is when they show up. I can't remember exactly when. I know it's after we do seagrass and we're doing sampling, so it's definitely when it's getting colder. My guess would be in November sometime.
Okay.
Maybe towards the end of November. But I think they're blue teals. I'm not sure, but I think that's what they are. It's got to be hundreds of thousands of them. Wow. And they stick to that same exact area where you're seeing these issues. I know, at least in upper Tampa Bay.
Interesting.
So I thought one might go with the other, is that I've seen an increase in number of them as well.
And at low tide, at a major low tide, some of that area just gets exposed, and it's you could pretty easily walk around the whole large chunks of that area.
Looking at that map, most areas are still grass, or those areas that actually go almost dry is what's still grass.
Yes, that's right. What we noticed in Old Tampa Bay is there's still fairly good seagrass, but it's in the shallowest areas of that segment.
Yeah, and just throw it out there an idea, maybe something to look at, maybe impacting that just is the large size of that flock.
Just what we need, Ryan, another confounding factor in Old Tampa Bay. Thanks.
Yeah, that's just stormwater quality. That's just water quality.
Maybe the estuary program
many impacts.
Do we have any other questions or comments for Chris? I know maybe a lot of you have kind of seen some of this info, but I thought it was important to share with this group. If nothing else, I did incorporate those preliminary numbers into the annual compliance assessment report, which you all gave your permission at the last meeting for me to send on. I just wanted to, I did include the link for you all to review the report with those preliminary numbers in there, just so you could see it. And I plan to send that out to FDEP and EPA today, this afternoon.
Yeah,
so.
And Maya, just if you use the preliminary numbers that I presented at the Seagrass Working Group meeting, and you know this, that some of those numbers changed for Old Tampa Bay and Hillsborough Bay, because we did some updates based on our accuracy assessment and further review of some of our field verification. So those numbers may be slightly different from what you saw today. But the numbers that I presented today are likely the final numbers. I don't anticipate there will be any other changes. So
my plan is they're all clearly noted in the annual compliance assessment report as preliminary numbers, and I would rather not change it like 3 times. So I'm going to submit the report with the preliminary information, but I do want it to be clear for this whole group that the final numbers will be more closely aligned with what Chris presented today.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Chris. Maya, I think that's a good segue into our next agenda item, the 2020 Annual Compliance Assessment Final Report.
Yeah, I don't really have anything other to say beyond what I just did. So that information is there with the preliminary Seagrass numbers for your information. Bill have already given me permission to submit that information to EPA and FDEP, so I plan to hit send this afternoon right after this meeting. But it's all there and available for you all to look at. Yeah, Ed's scrolling through right now. Thanks, Ed.
Smile.
Just push some updates to our repository to update some of those numbers based on Chris's presentation today. Some of the text still needs to be updated for the specific bay segments, but the graphic should start getting updated with the 34,297 number now.
Okay.
All right, Ed, you have a couple things here, Old Tampa Bay, and then obviously open discussion. Did you have anything specific on Old Tampa Bay that you wanted to discuss today with the group?
I think is just expanding on these results from the water management district. You know, we were anticipating these declines in seagrass coverage in Old Tampa Bay, and you know, we've been having these Old Tampa Bay working group discussions on sort of next steps in response to the prep of the 2022 reasonable assurance update. I mentioned, I think in the past, we've started to look at grant funding to further identify research needs and new management or scenario development for managing that Old Tampa Bay system. So we're hoping to hear some positive news probably around the July timeframe to kick off that effort and renewed interest in identifying, you know, how best to move forward with that bay segment in light of these results. So just wanted to put that on everyone's radar. And if you had any questions on next steps, I think we will probably start assembling another individual stakeholder meeting to kick off that new work, probably around the July-August timeframe.
Yeah, I wanted to get everyone sort of take the temperature. I think it works nicely to have an in-person meeting. I know, Rich, we were able to meet at the Clearwater offices off of US 19. I don't know if a partner, I don't know how y'all feel about starting to weave in-person events meetings back to in the summer. I think we're kind of in a transition period. We've had really great, I think, participation in the meetings virtually. But I wanted to put that out there as a possibility for that Old Tampa Bay meeting. Any thoughts?
Hey, Maya, one thought. This is Tom. Kelly brought this up at the management board meeting in reference to the TAC. And it is kind of a catch-22. I mean, we all want to get back together and see each other and meet, but the attendance for these meetings has been really off the charts. So, you know, you kind of hate to lose that momentum. I think so many more people are getting this information and being able to participate virtually. So I think at the very least, probably going forward, having that virtual option will help keep our numbers up and keep people engaged.
Yeah, I think that it is a challenge to do the hybrid meetings to make sure that we have the right facilities that can mic the room appropriately and have people here. But I agree that probably some sort of hybrid is the path forward. I don't know, sometimes y'all are more chatty when we're face to face. I think especially for that Old Tampa Bay working group, it might be beneficial to try and make the leap. But if people feel strongly that they prefer this virtual option, I just, you know, would appreciate hearing that from you all. You can type it in the chat if you don't want to talk.
Well, Ed, while we have everybody's attention here, should we try and pick out a date for our next meeting?
Yeah, we could do that. You guys still seeing my screen?
Yep.
Yes, sir.
I'm inclined to say mid to late July or even into August, because we probably won't be hearing back or have an official agreement in place with an anticipated grant for some of the old Tampa Bay work. But if there's a need to meet with this group before then, I'd be willing to entertain that. Any opposition to July 21st or 22nd?
Ed, I'd like to ask that you avoid that last week of July if possible.
Okay. The week of the 26th or the week of the 19th?
I think the 19th for me would be okay. I don't know how others feel though about family vacations and stuff. It might actually make sense if there's nothing pressing to maybe align that meeting with the school return to make sure everyone's back in town. I don't know if you think that's too far out, but
Well, gets in with the policy board and management board meetings, but
yeah,
we can do that still, as long as you have time.
18th, August 18th. Hillsborough, they go back on the 10th, right? I believe.
yeah, I think so. I think that's correct.
Do you know when Pinellas goes back, Maya?
I think it's the 11th or the 12th.
Is there any opposition to the 18th of August? All right, we'll book it.
I'll make a motion.
Ed, are you thinking that that's a full meeting or that's an old Tampa Bay working group meeting?
I think we were targeting an old Tampa Bay working group meeting to get the stakeholders back together, because we haven't specifically talked about next steps for that Bay segment.
Yep, that's what I was thinking too. I just want to make sure it was clear.
Hey, since Duke Energy is part of that, I do have a conflict on the 18th. Any problem with changing it to the 19th? Or I'm good any other day that week except that Wednesday. Sorry.
19th works. I believe. Let me go back to the main calendar. $19th.
Yep.
Thank you.
No problem.
All right, Ed, anything else for the agenda today?
I think we covered it, unless there's other discussion of the members.
I just one quick, John McGee pointed out my email address on the last slide of my presentation is my last name. The casualty of having too many vowels in your last name was misspelled. So I just put my correct email address in the chat windows. Sorry about
that. Did you misspell your own last name, Chris?
You know, yeah, I do misspell my own last name. So. I don't know what time of the night it was when I finally updated that slide. So yeah.
Understand. We're getting some feedback on the how to hold the next meeting
Yep.
in the chat.
And Jan was asking about the next full NMC meeting, and I'm thinking it'll be a little bit later in the fall after the Old Tampa Bay Working Group in August.
Yeah, I think when we're closer to September, October, we'll have water quality results through the majority of the year then that we could report on to you.
Yeah, and we should have the updated loading info from Ray too.
Yeah.
Okay.